An excavator's steel teeth struck not dirt, but reinforced concrete, sending a violent shudder through the rusted graveyard of the airfield. When the dust cleared, the workers weren't staring at a forgotten fuel tank. They were looking at a subterranean vault and a billion-dollar aviation mystery buried inside. Arthur Pendleton was a man drowning in inches of water. His Chicago architecture firm had gone under, leaving him with $400,000 in corporate debt, a second mortgage on his suburban home, and a marriage that communicated strictly through post-it notes on the refrigerator. At 42, Arthur was staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy. Then came the letter from the estate of Harry Gallagher. Harry was Arthur's great-uncle, a phantom of a man who had estranged himself from the family decades ago. Arthur only knew him through whispers at Thanksgiving, a brilliant but paranoid aviation mechanic who spent the 1970s and 80s fixing private jets for billionaires, politicians, and people who preferred their names kept off flight manifests. When Harry died at the age of 89, he left Arthur his sole remaining asset, Cypress Creek Airfield, a 400-acre private airstrip in the sun-blistered flatlands of West Texas. For exactly 48 hours, Arthur thought his prayers had been answered. He envisioned a lucrative sale to a massive logistics company. Real estate developers like Prologis or renewable energy giants like Next Era Energy were buying up massive tracts of flat Texas land for solar farms. Then Arthur drove down in his sputtering Ford F-150 to see his salvation. Cypress Creek Airfield was an environmental and structural nightmare. The cracked asphalt runway was fighting a losing battle against mesquite bushes and relentless tumbleweeds. 3 rusted Quonset huts sagged under the unforgiving Texas sun, their corrugated roofs groaning in the wind. The tarmac was littered with the skeletal remains of a rotting Cessna 150 and a stripped-down Piper Cub. Worse than the aesthetics was the liability. Waiting for Arthur by the chained link fence was David Henderson, an inspector for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. "Mr. Pendleton," Henderson said, barely looking up from his clipboard as Arthur stepped out of his truck. "Your great-uncle was running a rogue operation here for the last 20 years. We have records indicating there are three 10,000-gallon underground aviation fuel tanks on this property. They haven't been inspected since 1994. Before you can sell a single acre of this land, those tanks need to be excavated, tested, and removed. If they've leaked into the groundwater, the EPA will hold you personally liable for the cleanup. You're looking at millions." Arthur's heart plummeted into his stomach. The inheritance wasn't a lottery ticket. It was an anvil. Desperate, Arthur contacted Next Era Energy. Their acquisitions agent was interested in the acreage for a solar array, offering a cool $2 million, but the offer was strictly contingent on a clean environmental bill of health. No tanks, no contaminated soil. Arthur had exactly $12,000 left to his name. He couldn't afford a massive corporate engineering firm to do the extraction. He needed it done cheap, and he needed it done quietly. He found Leo Bronson at a diner 2 towns over. Leo was a grizzled, chain-smoking independent contractor who owned a battered Cat 320 excavator and asked very few questions. For $8,000 in cash, Leo agreed to dig up the tanks, hoist them onto a flatbed, and haul them to a specialized scrapyard. "I start Monday," Leo said, crushing a cigarette into a plastic ashtray. "But if I smell jet fuel in the dirt, the price doubles. I ain't getting shut down by the state for your uncle's mess." Arthur agreed, pitching a small camping tent inside the least rusted Quonset hut to save money on a motel. For the first 2 days, the West Texas heat was a physical weight. Leo's Cat 320 tore into the baked earth at the coordinates marked on Harry's old, faded property blueprints. By Tuesday evening, they unearthed the first tank. By a miracle, it was bone dry and intact. Wednesday yielded the second, similarly empty. Arthur began to breathe again. I was one tank away from a $2 million lifeline. Thursday morning, Leo moved the excavator to the final coordinate, nestled strangely far from the main runway, tucked tight against a sheer limestone ridge at the very edge of the property boundary. At 11:00 a.m., the bucket of the Cat 320 drove into the earth. But instead of the dull, hollow thud of a steel tank, the impact produced a deafening metallic clang that echoed across the empty plains. Sparks flew from the trench, and the massive hydraulic arm of the excavator shuddered violently, nearly throwing Leo from the cab. Leo killed the engine. The sudden silence was thick and heavy. Arthur sprinted from the shade of the hut, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust. What happened? Did you puncture it? Leo climbed down from the cab, grabbing a heavy iron shovel from the tracks. His face was pale beneath a thick layer of grime. That ain't a fuel tank, Pendleton. I've been digging for 30 years. Steel tanks ring. That sounded like I just hit a bank vault. Arthur grabbed a second shovel, and the two men slid into the 10-foot trench. The dirt here was different. It wasn't natural soil. It was a mix of gravel and engineered backfill. As they cleared the red dirt away, the shape of the anomaly began to reveal itself. It was a flat, horizontal slab of heavily reinforced concrete. Embedded within it was a massive set of corrugated steel doors, lying flush with the ground, secured by a titanium industrial padlock the size of Arthur's fist. "Your uncle didn't bury a tank here," Leo whispered, wiping sweat from his eyes. "He buried a bunker." Arthur stared at the heavy titanium lock, his mind racing. Why would a mechanic bury a massive set of subterranean doors beneath 20 feet of engineered landfill? "Cut it," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. Leo didn't argue. He climbed out of the trench and returned 20 minutes later, hauling an acetylene torch setup from the back of his rig. He sparked the torch, the bright blue flame hissing aggressively against the oppressive heat. It took 10 agonizing minutes of localized, intense heat to weaken the thick titanium shackle. With a heavy blow from a sledgehammer, the padlock snapped. The steel doors were too heavy to lift by hand. Leo hooked a heavy-grade tow chain from the doors to the hydraulic bucket of the Cat 320. "Stand back!" Leo yelled over the roar of the diesel engine. The excavator strained, its truss slipping in the loose dirt. Metal groaned, a horrific screech of rusted hinges protesting after decades of darkness. Slowly, violently, the heavy steel doors peeled upward, revealing a gaping rectangular maw in the earth. A rush of cold, stale air expelled from the darkness, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of aged leather, aviation grease, and ozone. Arthur grabbed a high-powered LED flashlight from his truck and walked to the edge of the abyss. A set of concrete stairs led downward into a cavernous, pitch-black space. It was not a small bunker. It was a subterranean hangar, climate-controlled, its walls lined with thick industrial moisture barriers. Arthur descended first, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the suspended dust. Leo followed close behind, his hand resting on the handle of a heavy wrench tucked into his belt. As Arthur swept the light across the room, The beam caught the reflection of polished chrome. He moved the light upward, and his breath caught in his throat. Sitting in the center of the concrete tomb was an airplane. It was utterly pristine, entirely devoid of the rust and decay that plagued the surface above. It wasn't a standard prop plane or a scrap heap. It was a Lockheed L-129 Jet Star, an early model, four-engine executive jet favored by heads of state and music legends in the 70s. But this one was different. It was painted in a deep, matte charcoal gray, devoid of any corporate logos or standard identifying stripes. "Holy Mother of God," Leo breathed, walking slowly toward the nose of the aircraft. Arthur hurried toward the tail, shining his light on the N number. N707RM. "We need to find a generator. There has to be a power source for this bunker," Arthur said. They found a heavy-duty diesel generator in the corner of the room. Hooked up to a massive auxiliary tank after some coaxing and priming, the generator roared to life, coughing thick black smoke into the ventilation system before settling into a steady hum. Fluorescent lights flickered on above, bathing the hangar in a sterile, harsh white glow. The Jetstar looked like a ghost ship. It was meticulously maintained. The tires were still properly inflated. The landing gear struts showed no signs of fluid leakage. Harry Gallagher hadn't just buried a plane, he had entombed it with the care of a pharaoh. Arthur walked up the lowered air stairs and stepped into the cabin. The interior was a breathtaking time capsule of 1980s billionaire luxury. Hand-stitched burled walnut paneling lined the fuselage. The seats were upholstered in deep burgundy leather. At the rear, a fully stocked wet bar featured crystal decanters and 3 unopened bottles of Macallan, 1926. "Whoever owned this wasn't just rich," Leo said, trailing behind him and whistling low. "They were royalty." Arthur stepped into the cockpit. The analog gauges and dials were frozen in time. Resting on the pilot's seat was a leather-bound flight logbook. Arthur opened it. The entries were meticulous, detailing flights between Geneva, the Cayman Islands, and Panama City. The final entry was dated July 12, 1991. The destination was simply listed as CC Oakhaven. "July 1991. Arthur muttered, his mind trying to connect the dots. He pulled out his smartphone. Miraculously, he had 2 bars of LTE down in the bunker. He typed the tail number, 703M, into an FAA registry search. Result? No records found. He tried a broader internet search. Nothing on the tail number. Then he searched for the aircraft model and the date. Lockheed Jet Star, missing July 1991. The search results populated instantly, and the blood drained from Arthur's face. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Look at this." Leo leaned over the phone. The headline on a digitized New York Times archive read, "BCCI Collapse, the vanishing fleet of the rogue bank." In July 1991, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, a massive international bank known to law enforcement as the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, was shut down globally by regulators. It had been laundering billions for intelligence agencies, dictators, and global syndicates. When the feds raided BCCI's assets, several of the bank's ultra-luxury private jets, allegedly used to move physical cash and black market gold across borders, vanished without a trace. "This plane belonged to the BCCI Phantom Fleet," Arthur said, his eyes wide. "My uncle must have been their mechanic. When the bank went down, they paid him to make this plane disappear." "Arthur," Leo said softly. Arthur looked up. Leo had walked past the wet bar and opened the heavy, reinforced cargo compartment at the rear of the cabin. Arthur moved down the narrow aisle. Inside the cargo hold, stacked with terrifying neatness, were 50 identical, heavy steel lock boxes. One of them had tipped over during the plane's final descent decades ago, the latch bursting open. Spilling out onto the carpeted floor of the Jetstar were dozens of heavy, dull yellow bars. They weren't just gold. They were stamped with the crest of the Swiss National Bank, completely untraceable, and worth tens of millions of dollars. Arthur stared at the fortune that could instantly erase his debts, buy back his life, and set his family up for generations. All he had to do was melt it down and sell it slowly. But as the silence of the bunker settled around them, a sharp, metallic ping echoed from the top of the stairs. Someone had just stepped onto the metal grate at the entrance of the bunker. Arthur and Leo froze. They weren't alone. The metallic ping echoed again, sharper this time, cutting through the low, steady hum of the diesel generator. It was the undeniable sound of a leather-soled shoe striking the steel-grated landing at the top of the concrete stairwell. Arthur's blood ran cold. He instinctively reached over the burled walnut wet bar and slapped the master cabin light switch, plunging the interior of the Jetstar into darkness. The only illumination came from the harsh fluorescent tubes fixed to the bunker's concrete ceiling outside the aircraft. Through the thick, reinforced oval windows of the fuselage, Arthur and Leo watched 3 silhouettes descend the stairs. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision. The 2 men in the rear carried compact, suppressed submachine guns, their muzzles sweeping the massive subterranean hangar. The man in the lead, however, was dressed entirely out of place. He wore a sharp, charcoal-gray, bespoke suit that seemed immune to the stifling West Texas heat, and he carried no visible weapon, save for a silver-tipped walking cane. Leo crouched low beneath the window line, his knuckles white as he gripped the heavy iron wrench. He locked eyes with Arthur, silently mouthing the word, "Cops." Arthur shook his head. State environmental inspectors didn't clear rooms with suppressed weapons, and local police didn't wear Savile Row suits to abandoned airfields. The man in the suit stopped at the bottom of the stairs, surveying the pristine Lockheed Jetstar with a look of profound, almost religious awe. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a smooth, upper-crust Bostonian drawl, amplified by a handheld megaphone. "Arthur Pendleton," the man called out, the sound bouncing off the moisture-barriered walls. "I know you are inside the aircraft. The thermal imaging drones we've had circling this property for the last 48 hours picked up the heat signatures of 2 men entering this vault. There is nowhere to run. Please, step out onto the air stairs so we can discuss this like civilized businessmen." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He remained frozen, his back pressed against the leather bulkheads of the cargo hold. "Allow me to introduce myself," the man continued, his footsteps echoing on the concrete as he slowly circled the plane. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I represent the private estate of a man named Adnan Khashoggi. Perhaps you've read about him. During the 1980s, Mr. Khashoggi was one of the wealthiest men on the planet, an international arms dealer of impeccable taste and ruthless efficiency. When the Bank of Credit and Commerce International collapsed in 1991, global authorities rushed to freeze his assets. Caldwell paused near the nose of the plane, running a gloved hand affectionately along the polished chrome of the pitot tube. "Mr. Khashoggi had a contingency plan," Caldwell shouted, his voice echoing with dangerous patience. "He loaded $50 million in untraceable Swiss gold onto this exact aircraft in Geneva. The flight was supposed to route to a private strip in Panama, far away from the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Justice. He hired the best off-the-books mechanic and pilot in the hemisphere to ensure the plane made it. Your great-uncle, Harry Gallagher." Arthur closed his eyes, the crushing reality of his uncle's legacy falling heavily upon his shoulders. Harry hadn't just been a mechanic for rogue billionaires. He had been the ultimate thief. "But old Harry got greedy." Caldwell's voice turned hard, losing its polished veneer. "He killed the co-pilot over the Atlantic, diverted the plane to his own private, wretched little airfield in Texas, and buried it. Khashoggi's people spent decades hunting for this plane. When Harry died, we knew the property would pass to his desperate, debt-ridden nephew. We knew you'd try to sell it. We created the shell company that offered to buy it for a solar farm, just to force you to dig up the grounds. The next era energy buyer. It had all been a lie, a manufactured crisis designed to make Arthur do the heavy lifting of finding the exact burial site. "We are coming aboard, Arthur," Caldwell announced. "If you surrender the gold, you and your mechanic friend can walk up those stairs, get in your rusted truck, and drive away. If you resist, Thomas and Victor will shoot you where you stand, and we will bury you in this concrete tomb for another 30 years. You have 10 seconds. Inside the pitch-black cabin, Leo crawled toward Arthur. "We can't let them on this plane," Leo whispered fiercely. "Men like that don't leave witnesses. They're going to put bullets in our heads the second they see our faces." Arthur knew Leo was right. He looked frantically around the dark cabin. His eyes darted to the cockpit. The Jetstar's auxiliary power unit was running. The plane was alive. "Leo," Arthur breathed, a desperate, wild idea forming in his panicked mind. "My uncle maintained this plane meticulously. The emergency systems are still active. Do you know what happens when a plane detects a catastrophic fire in the cargo hold?" Leo blinked, his grimy face twisting in confusion. "The halon system deploys. It sucks all the oxygen out of the air to kill the fire. It'll choke a man to death in 2 minutes. "Exactly," Arthur said. "Hold your breath." Arthur dropped to his stomach, and Army crawled down the narrow aisle, slipping past the velvet curtains into the cockpit. The analog instrument panels glowed with a faint, ghostly green luminescence. Outside, he could hear the heavy boots of Caldwell's men, clanking against the aluminum air stairs. They were boarding. Arthur's hands flew across the overhead panel. He found the red, wire-guarded toggle switches marked Fire Suppression, Cargo, Cabin. "Thomas, clear the back," Caldwell's voice barked from just inside the cabin door. Arthur took the deepest breath of his life, filling his lungs until they burned. He flipped the wire guards up, slammed both toggles forward, and hit the manual discharge button. A deafening, pressurized hiss erupted throughout the cabin, sounding like a hurricane forced through a straw. Instantly, overhead vents and floor valves violently expelled thick, blinding white halon gas. Chaos erupted in the fuselage. The heavy chemical agent immediately displaced the oxygen. Caldwell's men began coughing violently, their suppressed weapons firing blindly into the mahogany paneling and leather seats as panic overtook their tactical training. Bullets shattered the crystal decanters at the wet bar, showering the cabin in 80-year-old scotch and shattered glass. Arthur stayed low, practically flat against the carpet. Halon gas is heavier than air, but the initial deployment creates a thick, opaque fog. Through the dense white smoke, Arthur saw the silhouette of Thomas stumbling backward, clutching his throat as his lungs screamed for oxygen. Leo emerged from the shadows like a terrifying apparition, swinging the heavy iron wrench with the brutal force of a seasoned roughneck. He struck Thomas squarely in the side of the knee. A sickening crunch echoed above the hissing gas. The mercenary collapsed with a strangled cry, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Go!" Leo roared, though the lack of oxygen turned his voice into a raspy croak. Arthur scrambled out of the cockpit, grabbing the mercenary's dropped MP5 as he passed. He didn't know how to shoot it, but holding it made him feel significantly less like prey. He lunged out the cabin door and tumbled down the air stairs, hitting the concrete floor of the hangar hard. Leo was right behind him, dragging Caldwell, who had passed out from the oxygen deprivation, tossing the sharply dressed fixer onto the concrete like a sack of flour. The second mercenary, Victor, was still trapped deep in the cabin, firing blindly into the blinding fog, coughing up blood as the halon ravaged his respiratory system. "The stairs, get to the surface!" Arthur yelled, his own lungs burning on the verge of collapse. The two men sprinted for the concrete stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. The heat of the Texas afternoon hit them like a physical wall as they breached the surface, but the fresh, oxygen-rich air tasted sweeter than anything Arthur had ever consumed. He collapsed onto the red dirt, gasping violently, his vision swimming with dark spots. Below them, Caldwell was beginning to stir, groaning on the hangar floor as the halon gas slowly began to dissipate in the massive room. Worse, the second mercenary had staggered to the cabin door, spotting Arthur and Leo at the top of the stairs. "They're coming up!" Leo shouted, clutching his side where a stray piece of shrapnel had grazed his ribs. Arthur didn't hesitate. Adrenaline, fueled by the sheer terror of losing his life and the burning rage of being hunted, took complete control. He threw the submachine gun aside and sprinted toward the massive yellow Cat 320 excavator idling a few yards away. Arthur had watched Leo operate it for 4 days. He knew the basics. He scrambled into the cab, slammed the heavy glass door shut, and grabbed the hydraulic joysticks. The massive diesel engine roared as Arthur redlined the throttle. Down in the trench, Victor was halfway up the concrete stairs, raising his weapon toward the cab of the excavator. Arthur pulled the left joystick backward. The immense, steel-toothed bucket of the Cat 320 swung through the air in a brutal, sweeping arc. It didn't hit the mercenary. Instead, it slammed with earth-shattering force into the reinforced concrete retaining wall, holding the steel bunker doors open. The structural integrity of the 30-year-old concrete instantly failed. With a deafening crack that sounded like a thunderclap, the massive steel doors collapsed inward. Tons of red dirt, gravel, and shattered concrete violently cascaded down the stairwell, completely burying the entrance to the subterranean hangar in an impenetrable avalanche of debris. A massive cloud of red dust plumed into the sky, settling slowly over the ruined trench. Silence, absolute and profound, returned to Cypress Creek Airfield. The bunker was sealed. Caldwell, his men, the pristine Lockheed Jetstar, and $50 million in untraceable Swiss gold were buried beneath 40 tons of collapsed earth. Arthur sat in the idling excavator, his hands shaking so violently he could barely release the joysticks. Leo limped over to the side of the tracks, looking down at the massive pile of rubble, then up at Arthur. A slow, incredulous smile broke across the mechanic's dirt-caked face. "Well," Leo panted, pulling a crushed cigarette from his pocket and lighting it with trembling hands. "I'd say that's a structural failure. What's the play now, boss?" Arthur climbed down from the cab. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and dialed a number he had seen on a government website during his frantic late-night research into environmental liabilities. "I'm not going to run from Khashoggi's ghosts for the rest of my life," Arthur said, looking at the buried vault. "We're doing this legally." 4 hours later, a convoy of black Chevrolet Tahoes tore down the cracked asphalt of the airfield. They weren't local police. They were specialized agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Art and Antiquities Crime Team, accompanied by investigators from the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. Arthur had made a very specific phone call, invoking the False Claims Act and the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Program. The federal agents excavated the site over the next 3 weeks. Caldwell and his men were pulled from the bunker alive, having survived on the hangar's auxiliary oxygen tanks, and were immediately taken into federal custody for domestic terrorism and attempted murder. The gold, exactly as Caldwell had stated, belonged to the frozen estate of the BCCI collapse. It was a historic recovery of laundered assets, arguably the largest in American history. Because Arthur had proactively reported the discovery of stolen international assets on his property, and because the gold was seized by the federal government under civil forfeiture laws, Arthur was legally entitled to a whistleblower and recovery finder's fee. The Treasury Department, eager to close a 30-year-old global financial mystery, did not fight him. The government awarded Arthur Pendleton a standard 20% finder's fee of the recovered assets. After taxes, legal fees, and the massive environmental cleanup costs of the airfield, Arthur walked away with roughly $6 million in perfectly clean, thoroughly legal money. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a sports car. He paid off his corporate debt in a single afternoon. He paid off the second mortgage on his modest suburban home. He took his wife on a month-long trip to the Amalfi Coast, where they finally learned how to talk to each other without post-it notes, repairing a marriage that had been suffocated by the weight of financial terror. As for Leo Bronson, Arthur wired the grizzled contractor a cool $1 million as a consulting bonus. Leo retired his battered Cat 320, bought a pristine piece of land in Montana, and never dug another hole for the rest of his life. The Lockheed Jetstar, pristine and perfectly preserved, was confiscated by the DOJ and eventually donated to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. It sits in a hangar in Virginia, bearing a small plaque that details its illicit history as the Phantom of the Tarmac. Arthur never visited it. He had spent enough time in the dark, and for the first time in his life, he was finally enjoying the sunlight. What a wild journey. Arthur's nightmare turned into a multi-million-dollar rescue, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are buried where we least expect them. But what would you have done? Would you have taken the gold and run, or called the authorities like Arthur? Let me know your escape plan in the comments below. If you enjoyed this crazy, real-life, hidden treasure story, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible mysteries.